The talk I want to give today is the problem of inequality, and I even titled the presentation that way on purpose. So I've got a 2-year-old or 2.5-year-old, and so I read a lot of children's literature these days. And this is a famous book, Duck Rabbit, in which two individuals discuss the perspective of whether that is indeed a duck or a rabbit. Okay. I want to frame our thinking about inequality as a problem using something this simple, right? Is inequality a problem? Yes or no? Some people, I'm going to argue, are going to say that inequality is a problem. It always will be a problem, and it's something that does need to be addressed through politics. Other people are going to say that inequality maybe is not necessarily not a problem, but is a minimal problem because as long as we provide opportunities to the poor, right, there'll be upward mobility and other things to sort of take care of them. But that said, I think the worst thing one can do is ignore the discussion completely. Because if we really think that, oh, you know, pish-posh, inequality is not a problem, that's just going up the wrong tree there. You're basically giving the field completely to the other side of things, right? Those who do feel it is a problem, and they will command all of the attention for it. So what I want to do today is give you 3 big ideas about how we can address inequality from a free market perspective. How is it, if it is a problem, why is it maybe not as big of a problem as some would advocate? And like, how could we speak to that in a very simple manner? So before we go to those 3 propositions, let me give you this is kind of the most recent claim on the scene that's really gotten a lot of attention, at least in my world, and some of you have probably heard of this gentleman as well. This is Thomas Piketty. He's a French economist, and he's just released a book called Capital in the 21st Century. What Piketty has done is taken an enormous amount of data and shown that indeed inequality with respect to ownership of a capital has increased quite a bit. So if you can see the graph, what we have is we have ownership of capital spiking in the pre-World War I era, and then going down mainly because capital was destroyed, right, by the 2 worlds. And also there were quite a bit of progressive policies during this period. I mean, this is the New Deal, the Great Society, all of that. And then suddenly capital ownership is becoming increasingly concentrated, and now we're basically almost to the point of our pre-World War I peak. All right? So what I was just saying is describing this slide here, where we've got high concentrations of capital ownership going down during the war periods and back up again, right? So Piketty would say this is a huge problem, right? We've got massive amounts of inequality with respect to ownership of wealth, capital. We need to do something about it. And I'll get to the points he makes a little bit later. All right, so that's kind of that's setting the stage for the debate, right? So inequality is out there in some regards. What should we do about it? Well, I'm going to give you 3 propositions when we think about inequality. The first one is that growth matters much more than distribution. All right? That's not necessarily an objective fact, but when we look at the power of economic growth, if we look at growth trends and so forth, we see that it addresses quite a few of the problems that we would try to address with distribution. And furthermore, if in changing distribution, if in tackling inequality, we hinder that economic growth, we're actually doing a major disservice to our children and grandchildren. The second one is that the state, probably no surprise with this group, the state doesn't play such a good role as wealth distributor. All right, the state has sort of had its shot for decades in terms of turning the lives of the poor around, and we don't really see a lot of progress on that dimension. And so there's some disjuncture, I think, between the ideas that some left-wing economists have about the world we live in and the policies that can make it better. Finally, I have a more complicated point that I saved to the end, but it's an important one, and it's that theory should not be the handmaiden to empirics, or as I like to say, my translation here, don't believe the hype. All right? Just because we find new facts and so forth, this isn't something to just completely jettison our way of thinking about our world. All right, so let's get into this. So the first one is that growth matters way more than distribution. What happened is in the year 1800, if you take all of the country's wealth, all right, and put it on a graph where, let's say, the y-axis is health, all right, and the x-axis is GDP per capita, all right, or just average income, right? Where would you think all the countries would be in the year 1800? Like if this is really good and this is really bad, where were we at? Really bad, right? All of the countries, the Western countries, Europe, everything was right here, stuck in Poorville in 1800. All right, it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution, which still the major effects of which had not been felt, even in the year 1800, started moving, that these countries started booming. All right, and then suddenly you see countries moving up and up and up and up. Why is that important? Well, we have to know where we come from, right, to know what we should do with what we've got. I think a lot of people want to take sort of a snapshot of income today and say, well, this is the way the world's always been. But it's just not true, right? If we think of another way of thinking about it visually is imagine that total wealth and its distribution is a pie, right, like a pie chart. And pieces of that pie are going to other places, right? That pie has increased dramatically over time. So let's say, for example, what would you rather have, a 15% share of a pie worth $1,000 or a 5% share of a pie worth $1 million? Okay, so obviously if my share of overall income is decreasing, that in and of itself does not mean I'm less wealthy, right? In fact, in true fact, right, we're actually all a lot more wealthy, even if the concentration of wealth has increased. All right, here's a simple financial principle that some of you, it may seem obvious, other you, it may be a revisit to your college days, but the rule of 70. So this is something that is used in used in finance, of course, to determine the future value of assets, but you also can do it with the future value of countries' wealth. So take the number 70, divide it by the annual growth rate, and it produces the number of years it takes for the economy to double. So the U.S., for example, is kind of the low bar right now. The IMF just came up with a study that says we're going to be at 2% for the foreseeable future. Not so great. But still at 2%, that means in 35 years, the entire economy is going to double. All right, so in a little more than a generation, we're going to have twice as much stuff as we have now. Now, surely a lot of that is going to go to the upper income areas, but some of that is going to go everywhere, basically, right? Again, it's that pie increasing. If we look at other areas like China, one thing I always talk to my students about to sort of understand how much growth matters is, do you think you'd read about China in the Wall Street Journal in like 1950? Do you think China would be on the front page? What's going on in China? The only thing you might read about is like, battles or conflict or something going on in China. You certainly wouldn't be hearing about Chinese production in 1950. But if you can get a country like China to have growth rates in the double digits, then suddenly what are we all talking about, right? We're talking about China because their wealth has increased so dramatically. So even they're at kind of a lower point right now at 7%, but that's still doubling every 10 years. It's amazing. And then finally, world growth is about 3%, which is approximately 24 years. So that's a generation. Every generation, the entire world is getting twice as big in terms of its wealth. All right, so that's incredible stuff. Okay, so wrapping up this point about thinking about the pie increasing, this is Robert Lucas Jr. He's a Chicago economist who won the Nobel Prize. He thought a lot about world growth over time, and distribution, and he decided that once you start thinking about the growth angle, it's really hard to think about anything else. Okay, and as a Nobel Prize winner who's thought a lot about this issue, I just think that's a powerful statement there, that he says the consequences are simply staggering. It's hard to think about anything else. All right, now, knowing what you just heard, right, now let's think about Piketty's claims. Piketty's claims would say that the pre-war eras are just as bad as where we're at now. What's missing from that logic? What's missing is that we assume, at least from the graph, that total income has not changed, right? So 18% or 20% rather is going to the rich, and it looks like, oh, we're back at 20% again. We're just as poor as we used to be. But it's just not true, right? Because it's 20% of a variable that is increasing dramatically. So 20% here is nothing compared to 20% over here, right? And so what's left over is, again, very, very significant, much, much larger than it was in the year 1900. And the quality of life that we all enjoy today versus 100 years ago is testament to that. All right, so that's the first one. Again, I think growth trumps distribution when we're really thinking about the plight of the poor, when we're thinking about how to make people live better lives and so forth. The second one, you know, I may be batting for the home team on this one. The state plays a poor role as wealth distributor. Even if we say, okay, fine, growth is great, but look, we still need to have certain programs that take care of those who don't have what they need to survive and so forth. What can we do about it? Well, let's bring in the state, right? Because that seems to be the default. So Piketty has this great quote here. He says, if democracy is to regain control over the globalized financial capitalism of this century, the ideal tool would be a progressive global tax on capital. Got to go progressive, right? That's the way to do it these days. Such a tax would provide a way to avoid an endless inegalitarian spiral and to control the worrisome dynamics of global capital concentration. Powerful stuff. There's a couple of things in there, though, that I do have to note. First, he says if democracy is to regain control over the globalized financial capitalism, which to my mind that means voters. You know, at Winthrop I worked in a polling lab, and so all we would do is take surveys and learn voter knowledge. And I tell you, if you ever want to get skeptical or even a little bit depressed about democracy, work in a polling lab. So again, it's not to say that society shouldn't have a vote or a say, but when I hear things like democracy needs to regain control, I don't know really who he's talking about, because if he's talking about those voters that we surveyed, I'm not sure I want them in charge of anything, at least in the political realm. Okay, but let's look at his idea here, a progressive tax. The trouble with the progressive tax is it never gets too progressive. The thing is that, well, what you're seeing, let me describe the graph and then I'll get to my points. So the graph here is the red line is the nominal tax rate. Okay, so this is the tax rate on the books and that people were seeing on their tax returns. The blue line is the income actually coming into the government. What do you notice about the blue line? It doesn't change, right? The revenue that the government is utilizing is not changing no matter what's happening to the red line. So bottom line, even a person like Piketty would have to admit that we're not very good at collecting that tax, right? Even when we make it super progressive. Look at that, 90%, right? We're not collecting what we assume we need to be collecting with the tax rate that high, right? And there's some supply side economics going on there too. If you're taxed at 90%, are you even going to create all the wealth that you were before? Probably not, right? And so that's going to diminish tax revenues as well. So there's a lot of reasons here why progressive taxes don't end up working the way they should. But barring the reasons, the reality is we don't, right? So this is something we would need to improve. All right, well, Mr. Piketty is on the case. He says before we can learn to efficiently organize public financing, equivalent to 2/3 to 3/4 of national income, it would be good to improve the organization and operation of the existing public sector. Yeah, I agree with that. That'd be a great idea. Let's improve that. Let's improve that organization operation. But as you can imagine, that's sort of where he ends the discussion. He says, you know, it's something we should do. Let's get on that, okay? Pull a few levers and get it done so we can get all my great ideas done. But obviously we know, right, that's not going to happen anytime soon. Before we think about why it's not going to happen, though, I think this is a really important point in thinking about that other perspective, the duck-rabbit sort of dichotomy, right? What are other people thinking when they promote policies that we all know as ineffective, right? They're thinking that the state can just pull it off, right? That it's just something, oh, you know, they'll handle it, right? They'll take care of it. They just really haven't thought through the politics of it. And it's actually a very common problem, not just among laymen, but economists as well. So this is a longer quote. I'll just read just a little bit of it here, or let me just kind of describe it. This is James Tobin. He was a Nobel Prize winner as well, but he was more of a left-wing economist. He's a Keynesian. And his argument is, look, politics is not my problem. I'm an economist. I'm going to be like Piketty. I'm going to promote what I think are the best ideas and the best policies, and what they do with it is their problem, right? So he even says that it's not for me to withhold advice, even if I know that they would misuse it. Okay, that's sort of the claim. It's a claim I disagree with, but it's important to realize it's a way of thinking about politics that's very much behind a lot of the, frankly, nonsense that comes out of these positions, that perspective. Okay, let's get to one I do agree with. This is a quote from the Nobel Prize winner, the late Nobel Prize winner, James Buchanan. Buchanan said, look, this is in fact our responsibility as academics to see what would our ideas actually do, right? We have to be considerate of the political process. If the public sector is incapable of doing a progressive income tax, we should talk about that, right? That should actually be in the theory, in the book, and not just one sentence, right? So for Buchanan, his whole career was based around the idea that politics are based upon incentives and an incentive structure just like everything else. And if we understand the incentives, we understand the institutions and so forth, we can get a pretty good idea of what's going to be effective and what's not going to be effective. And we can get a better idea of why things like the progressive income tax or massive distributions to the poor are not happening, right, the way they should. So I'll just go through a few of those. You know, one of the things, if you think about how much of GDP government has, 20%, right? I've heard before that works out to something like, if you chop that up for all families below the, I don't know, let's say the $50,000 income line, it'd work out to something like $40,000 per household, okay? So why doesn't the government just take all of that money and chop it up that way and give all the poor a $40,000 paycheck every year, and there'd be no poor, right? Or at least the poor mark would now be $40,000. Okay, seems simple enough and would be far more effective than the things that they do. So why don't they? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the reasons economists point to is that, like it or not, doesn't matter how much we shout about it, the poor is not the client, okay, from the politician's perspective, and it's never going to be. The client, so to speak, is going to be the median voter, the swing voter. All right, so politicians obviously want to win elections in order to get their policies passed through. So who do they need to placate? Well, obviously they need to placate special interest groups, lobbyists, all these kinds of folks. But at the end of the day, the person who matters the most is the swing voter. The people who are always going to vote Republican or always going to vote Democrat. They're important in terms of kind of galvanizing the base and so forth, but when it really comes down to the pinch, right, you've got to placate that median voter. Well, the median voter is way more wealthy, right, than $40,000. They're usually probably at something like a $50,000 or $60,000 per household. So they just don't need that supplement, right? They don't need that subsidy. Or at least giving every median voter $40,000 would probably be something that would tear the political system apart. Right, so if we understand that the goal of the politician is not going to be helping the poor above all else, we need to take that into our considerations of what policies are actually going to be possible. Number two is one that you know, I really don't need to touch on too much. I'm sure you know about it, special interest groups and rent seeking. This is when businesses, as we call it, cronyism, right, where businesses try to get into the pockets of government and try to get legislation pointed towards them. instead of towards the goals of the public at large. So I've got this book coming out with my grandfather that John mentioned, Bootleggers and Baptists. It's a neat title. I like that. And my understanding is we're still in the Bible Belt. It's like a long belt. I guess it goes from me in South Carolina all the way over here. But those are two terms I assume that you all are familiar with in their original sense. So the bootlegger and Baptist idea is that a bootlegger loves Sunday alcohol closings. A Baptist also loves Sunday alcohol closings, right? So this is something where bootleggers and Baptists may not get together, but they certainly advocate the same policies. Well, if you use those groups as metaphors for bootleggers being economic interest and Baptists being moral interest, you find those kinds of groups all the time, right? So think about healthcare reform. All the people in the news are going to be healthcare advocates, people who say the poor need more access to healthcare and so forth. But who's actually going to write the bills? Is it going to be the Baptists? No, right? It's going to be bootleggers. It's going to be lawyers who are working for insurance companies, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and so forth. And why are they going to be there? It's not because they're corrupt. It's because they have billions to lose or gain depending on that legislation. So to assume that they're not going to be a major part of that conversation is just naive, right? And so we see with Obamacare, with as messy as it's become, one of the major reasons is because so many groups got involved in the actual crafting of the legislation to where what has come out is something that's unworkable, right? All right, so again, we know that these groups are going to be a part of the game. Assuming them away is just silly. It's just not going to happen. So we have to keep that in our mental model of what government's actually going to be able to do in terms of wealth redistribution. Okay, the third one, growth of bureaucracy. Obviously, bureaucrats want to keep their jobs, and so even if they're not doing something that's effective, they're gonna keep going anyway. And we've seen a major growth of bureaucracy, of course, in the 20th century and going now into the 21st century. And finally, unintended consequences. Obamacare is a great example of that. How many times has there been some policy, right, that was supposed to do X and ended up doing Y instead, right? All the canceled policies that happened about 6 months ago is a great example of this, right? I promise you that was not a goal of the administration. Let's go ahead and cancel as many voters' policies as I can think of. No, they did not want that to happen. Or having that website not run for several months after its launch. Again, that's something they did not want to have happen, but we have to recognize with something that big trying to work itself, right, there's going to inevitably be unintended consequences, right? They just don't have control over the situation that they think they do. Okay, so let's get to my last proposition here. Again, this one's going to be a little bit more complicated, but I think it's important and it's going to give you a good takeaway. All right, so theory should not play handmaiden to empirics, or don't believe the hype, as Flavor Flav would say. So theory and empirics, what is that? What are those fancy words? Well, theory and empirics are just ideas and facts. All right, so just take your underlying rationale for things, your ideas. All right, that's your theory. And then what are empirics? What is empirical observation? Well, that's facts. Those are things going on out there in the real world. So your ideas and facts interact all the time. They, in fact, cannot interact without one another. This is an important point. There is no such thing as an objective fact. All right? Even I'm guilty of saying that from time to time. Yeah, this fact's objective just because it'd be hard to dismiss it, right? But facts do not interpret themselves. We interpret facts. And how do we interpret them? We interpret them based upon our ideas, how we think of the world. All right? Now, so ideas, in other words, precede our understanding of the facts, right? It precedes our understanding of what we observe. Now, it's important. It's not true that facts can justify anything. Some people say that. I think that's, in fact, a false statement, right? That it's not like there's an infinite amount of facts out there, right? There are certain things, there are hard constraints, there are hard facts out there that we do have to grapple with. However, it is true that theory can justify any set of facts. In other words, given a set of facts, given a set of observations, a lot of different theories could make sense of that. Some of those theories are going to be better than others, and that's why it's so important. My conclusion here is that good theory is essential. In other words, we've got to get the theory right before we get to the facts, or otherwise the facts will lead us astray. So let's go into some examples of how this works. All right? So one of the major policies coming out of this discussion of inequality is, of course, the minimum wage. The minimum wage is something that economists, well, up until recently, were almost universally against because it destroys jobs and hurts market progress. But it just sounds good, doesn't it? Right? It just sounds good. I mean, I tell my students all the time, how about we have a minimum wage of $50 an hour? They say, that sounds awesome, Professor Smith. Let's do it. I said, guys, even I'm out of a job at that point. Oh, okay, I see, right? So the problem with the minimum wage is it's not that you're changing how valuable people are, right? It's that you're changing what they can be paid, and you're changing the cost structure of businesses. And so if you're increasing those costs, then that is going to come with a trade-off, right? Now, one thing that trips people up is, so let's say we adjust the minimum wage from, I think it's $7.25 right now. Let's say we change it to $7.50. Right? Does anyone think there's going to be just some mass exodus of jobs and massive unemployment? No, right? And in fact, it's probably going to be a wash if we look at some other adjustment factors and so forth. So a lot of people would say, oh, well, this is indication that the theory's bunk, right? The theory's not wrong. I think that's a very dangerous conclusion because, again, I think we all know that $50 would be too much, right? This would start to happen. This is just simple supply and demand graph, and right here is our shortfall of jobs, right? So the higher that wage goes, the more unemployment, right, is going to go up as jobs decrease. So at some point, this effect is going to kick in, and it's going to kick in with a vengeance. And the reason we know that is, again, because that's good theory. That's supply and demand. It's something that applies to so many other valuations in the market. The fact that it wouldn't apply to labor is absurd. So, and we do have great evidence of the relationship between labor markets, or unemployment rather, and regulation of labor markets. So European unemployment is far more pronounced than U.S., largely due to those more stringent labor laws. Believe it or not, there are places in Europe without a minimum wage. Germany is one of them. And so there are several countries that don't have minimum wages. And there's other countries, though, of course, that do, like France. So, we know for a fact, right, that countries with wage laws in Europe experience a third greater unemployment than those that do not. So in Europe, when they talk about the minimum wage, they're serious about it, right? This isn't like $7.25. It's like $15 an hour, all right? And so we're seeing that $50 an hour kind of threshold, that upper bound, start to get met. And so we see a huge drop-off in the number of jobs available. This matters. And again, if we're trying to help the poor, it seems like we're moving in the wrong direction there. There's also some dynamic effects that we're starting to learn about minimum wage laws that, again, are very hard to see. It's sort of the seen and the unseen, as my Bastiat colleagues will appreciate. A 10% increase, this is a recent study by a friend of mine, Jonathan Meir. A 10% increase in minimum wage leads to 25% decrease in job growth in the first year alone. That sucks, right? So a 10% increase doesn't seem like much, but what it's doing is it's eradicating the availability of certain jobs, right? They're just not cost-effective anymore. And so why would businesses create those jobs? And in fact, the bigger problem is that businesses are already expecting this to happen. Right? So they're moving way before the law actually gets passed. So the destruction of those jobs, the lack of entrepreneurial creation, is going to come way before the legislation itself. So by the time the legislation itself comes around, there may not be much change, right? Because the change has already occurred. But that makes it very easy to sort of dismiss that. But again, if we have this theory in the back of our mind, less so. All right, thinking about the minimum wage, another thing I want to talk about is thinking about wages, period, because this is something that's in the news all the time. All right, so obviously the minimum wage is contestable, but what about the wages of other workers? What determines it? Well, again, let's get our theory straight. I'm gonna say, you know, I'm gonna humbly advocate for supply and demand. I think it's a pretty good theory. I think it's worked out well, okay? So if we think about supply and demand with respect to the value of a worker, what's the value of a worker? Well, first there's demand, of course. There's the demand for the worker's services. What are those services going to provide to the company? And then there's the supply, right? The scarcity of skills, experience, synthesis of ideas, all the other kinds of things that workers are going to be able to provide to the company. All right? So in other words, it's value to the company in scarcity that's going to determine value. Let me give you a quick story that I tell my kids, you know. Hardest job I ever had. Hardest job I ever had is, believe it or not this one. Okay? This is not the hardest job I've ever had. This is, in fact, pretty lightweight relative to the jobs I've had. Hardest job I ever had was working in a kitchen in a bar in college. It was thankless work. It was just thankless work. I made, you know, $8.25, which was awesome back then, you know, over minimum wage. But it still wasn't worth it in the end. But I worked at that job for about 6 months, and we had things like fryer night. Next time you go to fryer night, or not fryer night, I call it fryer night right there, wing night. All right. Next time you go to wing night, think about the poor schmuck like me back there, you know, dousing hundreds of wings at a time, all right, trying to keep up with all that demand, all right? It's brutal and terrible. So, you know, I'd come home just smelling like wing grease. I'd have to go back in at 8 o'clock, you know, for first shift. There's all the prep. Everybody hates everybody in the kitchen, right? You know, because it's just we're all in the same situation together. It was miserable. All right. So that's the hardest I've ever worked in my life. And I was paid far less than I'm paid now. Why? I thought hard work was what it's all about, right? I thought working hard, I thought it being a tough job, I should be paid like a CEO or something, right? No, that's not how value works. That's not how the game works. And we all, especially college students, need to be conscious of that. It's, again, the scarcity of your service. Believe it or not, a lot of people can dip wings in fryers. It's true. It's true. All right? And so because of that, the wages for a position like that are not going to be especially high because the worker is a dime a dozen at that point. Somebody who, for example, can run the front of house, mingle with customers, make sure the kitchen, you know, is not hating itself too much, right? That's a more scarce service. And so while that person may not be as miserable as some of us in the kitchen, they're going to be compensated more. Why? Because their skills are more scarce. Okay, scarcity is what creates value. So once we have that theory in mind, we can begin to understand the wage breakdown a lot better and not get sidetracked by some of the inappropriate comparisons. All right, what you're looking at right now is CEO pay as a multiple of the average worker pay. This is something that you see all the time in the news. All right, news companies can't get enough of giving this fact out. So CEOs are paid too much, right? They're being paid way more than the average worker. All right, so I'm going to make the argument that saying CEOs are paid too much is comparing you know, apples and oranges. You're comparing one skill set to an incredibly different skill set and trying to say that the two are just as scarce as one another, right? That the fry cook and the person who owns the enterprise are basically the same person providing the same service, and it's just not true. All right. Another thing I should say before I go to my next slide, another thing I should say is I hear the fact a lot, well, what are CEOs doing that they weren't doing? Where's the beginning of this graph? Well, let's just even peg it at this point, right? What are CEOs doing now that they weren't doing in 1970, right? Surely that the entrepreneurial ability and so forth of CEOs has not gone up by a factor of, oh, what, 5 there, right? That seems hard to justify. And indeed, I think that would be difficult to justify if that was alone the explanation. Okay, the next graph, I think, gives us a much better explanation of why CEOs are paid what they are. So we still have some of those same lines. We've got average worker pay. We've got corporate profits, which you see the lines do kind of mimic. But more important, what's the big factor that's changed since 1970? It's not the pay of the average worker. It's certainly not much the minimum wage, at least in real dollars, right, discounted for inflation. It's the value of the company itself, all right? A CEO is someone who is responsible for the value of an asset. And so their decisions can, again, depending on the company, right, move the company in terms of direction billions of dollars, right, one way or another. So it would make sense that pay would track, right, the value of the underlying asset that they are controlling, that they are responsible for. Now we also know that CEOs tend to have very short tenure, unless you're the CEO of BB&T, that is, right? You're going to have short tenure, and there's a lot of turnover. And furthermore, I'm not going to justify all of CEO pay, because there is a pretty strong literature that there is rent seeking actually within the company. And so some of the highest paid CEOs, those are places where the CEO has kind of taken control of their own board, and there may be a bit excess pay at that point. But that's a much smaller region, right, of the overall difference. That would be right there, the difference between those lines. That's a much smaller difference than the large difference between the average worker, all right? And so someone who is to say that this is wrong because it doesn't track this line would have to explain to me, well, why does it seem to go with that line so well, right? Why does it correlate so well with that? Clearly, the market is responding to incentives, right, and paying those CEOs appropriately. And so to deny that, again, is just to kind of use bad theory as your explanation. Okay, yeah, so I'm wrapping up here with just one final point, one final thought to how to think about theory and facts, okay? So James Buchanan, the economist I mentioned previously, his overarching program was called Constitutional Political Economy, which is a fancy way of, let's think about the rules of the game first. Let's think about the underlying institutions that makes our society run. Because it's very easy to forget that. It's very easy to forget, for example, that we're so much wealthier than people in the year 1900. Anybody in here around at the year 1900? Yeah? All right, so it's pretty easy for us to forget considering we weren't there, right? So, but still it matters, and it matters quite a bit. So to use an example like basketball, thinking about Greg Marshall earlier, right? Rules of the game versus play in the game. All right? There's bad plays all the time. There's bad games. There's bad calls even. Right? There's all kinds of things that we would describe as bad. Usually, not always, but usually we would not attribute that to the game itself, though. Right? We wouldn't say, well, it's not fair because you shouldn't be able to shoot a three-pointer, for example. Right? In other words, we've all kind of agreed to the system itself. It's just the outcomes that we're disputing. But we're not disputing the system itself for that. We're not trying to just completely change the way the game is played just because one person didn't make a shot, right? It's something more where we're just kind of complaining, how come they didn't make that shot? Think about this when we're thinking about policies and institutions. Think about this, think about a progressive tax on capital that would represent 2/3 to 3/4 of GDP, all right? Do you think that might have an effect on the underlying institutions of our society? If the state just decided to abstract that much wealth, could that possibly play a role in changing how we conceive of property rights, how we conceive of investment, how we conceive of how we do everything with our money? I think it would, obviously, right? So this would be something like, someone misses a shot and we decide to completely upend the rules of basketball. I think most of us would realize that's a bad idea. And so I think looking at one bad policy outcome or one outcome we don't like so much, we still need to be very cautious, I think, before we just completely uproot the political legal order under which we live. All right. So a last few facts to give evidence to that theory. You're not going to be able to see what's on the axis, so let me just describe it. These are looking at correlations between regulatory efforts, all right, so initiatives that do change the political legal order, and distrust as measurement by surveys, all right? How trustful are you about people around you, that sort of thing, okay? So one's kind of a feeling, and the other thing is just hard facts about regulation in a bunch of countries, okay, a cross-country index. So each of these graphs gives us insight into how regulation, even I can't see it off the graph, let me see it on mine, Each of these gives us insight about how regulation affects trust. So the first one is freedom in price setting, all right? So how free are you to make your own prices? Well, guess what? The less free you are, right, the less trust there is in the society. The more distrust goes up, all right? The second one is rigidity of employment index. That just means how easy is it to hire and fire and pay and change pay and all that kind of stuff. How much control do you have of your worker? The harder that is to do, the more distrust there is in the society. And again, this isn't just distrust like of capitalists. This is workers, this is everybody, right, across the society. The other two, regulation of the minimum wage. The more we regulate the minimum wage, the more distrust we tend to sow in the society. And then finally, court formalism. The more stringent courts are, the harder it is to use courts well because of bureaucracy and so forth, the more distrust that seeds in the society as well. So here we see again some powerful evidence of how mucking with the social order can actually collapse a lot of things that we rely on to, to get along with each other and so forth. So again, I think it's a powerful observation. Okay, so let me conclude bringing us back to our children's book of Duck Rabbit, all right? So if I wasn't speaking to the Pachyderm Club, if I was speaking to the Sierra Club, would I completely converted everybody over to the free market perspective? I doubt it. And I don't think you ever will, because I think other people have also well worked out, articulate theories about the way the world works, and no amount of evidence is going to change that. But the point is, and so to take an economic term, I'm not trying to convert the radicals. I'm trying to convert the marginal person, right? I mean, my day job is converting students, right? So I'm trying to convert people who don't quite have a good theory for how the world works. And I think most people don't. I don't think most people have engaged politics to that level. And so hopefully these are three ideas, right, that can give you a powerful means of giving people better theory, giving people better ideas, so we can make use of facts in the right way. Thank you.